The strange knock at my door the morning began like any other, yet carried an unshakable stillness that made the air feel heavier than usual. Dawn light seeped through the curtains, casting pale golden stripes across the living room floor. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee when the sharp, abrupt sound of my doorbell shattered the quiet. It was not the casual, impatient press of a neighbor, nor the friendly double chime of a delivery driver. This was a sustained, deliberate ring followed immediately by a loud, authoritative knock that reverberated through the door. I paused mid-sip, the bitterness of the coffee lingering on my tongue, as an inexplicable sense of alertness washed over me. Instinct, the kind that only years in law enforcement could sharpen, told me this was no ordinary visit. When I opened the door, two figures stood before me. They were dressed in uniforms resembling police attire, but the details were wrong subtly, yet unmistakably wrong to the trained eye. Their shirts bore metallic-looking patches that appeared cheap and slightly crooked. The word police was printed across their chests in bold, but the font and stitching were inconsistent with any legitimate department I had encountered. One of them, a tall man with an angular jaw and eyes that darted around like a nervous thief, stepped forward and flashed what he must have thought was a convincing badge. To someone without my background, it might have looked genuine, but the coloring was off and the emblem had a poorly replicated seal. The shorter man, heavier in build, carried a clipboard in one hand and a pair of handcuffs in the other dangling them in plain sight as if to make a point. "Sir," the tall one began, his voice deep but lacking the practiced authority of a true officer, "we are here on behalf of the Homeowners Association's Enforcement Division. You are in violation of multiple community regulations, and we have been authorized to detain you until further notice." His words were rehearsed, almost mechanical, yet they carried an undertone of aggression that was impossible to miss. My Yandi. Eyebrows lifted slightly in mock surprise, though inside I was already cataloging every detail: facial features, posture, voice patterns, the exact make and model of their uniforms. "Detain me?" I repeated, letting my tone hover between disbelief and mild irritation. "For what, exactly?" The heavier man stepped forward, flipping a few pages on his clipboard with exaggerated slowness, as if trying to buy time. "You have repeatedly failed to comply with HOA Code Section 24, subsection B, regarding unauthorized mailbox colors," he said, glancing up with a smirk that barely hid his satisfaction. "And according to our report, you have also planted non-approved vegetation in your front garden, specifically 2 rosebush and 1 hydrangea. Such infractions are grounds for immediate intervention." If it had been any other day, I might have laughed outright at the absurdity, but my instincts told me this was not about flowers or paint. These men were fishing for something, or someone, and this was merely their opening move. I stepped back slightly, my hand resting casually on the edge of the door, while my other hand subtly activated the small recording device I kept hidden under the entryway table. "I see," I said slowly. "And your authority to detain me, where exactly does that come from? The police department? The HOA board? Or did you just print it off the internet this morning?" My words were deliberate, my tone calm but edged, with just enough skepticism to test their reactions. The tall man's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking briefly to his partner before returning to me. "Sir, I suggest you cooperate. Things will go much smoother for you if you come with us now." In my mind, I was already building the profile. Fake officers, poorly constructed legal pretense, vague threats designed to pressure compliance. This was not random. They had chosen me specifically, which meant they either did not know who I really was, or they were testing to see if I would reveal it. For the past 2 years, I had been living here under a quiet cover, posing as a freelance consultant while conducting discreet fieldwork for the FBI. My neighbors saw me as the polite, slightly reserved man who paid his dues on time and never made trouble. In truth, My work often involved dismantling organized scams, infiltrating small criminal networks, and in rare cases, dealing with more dangerous threats that slipped under the radar of local authorities. What stood on my porch now had all the hallmarks of a coordinated scam, one that was bold enough to knock on my door in broad daylight. I leaned against the doorframe, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them shift uncomfortably. "Tell you what," I finally said, keeping my voice casual. "Why don't we step inside, and you can show me all the documentation you have? I would like to see exactly where it says you can arrest a man over roses and mailbox paint." The heavier man chuckled, but it was forced, and he shook his head. "No, sir, we will not be entering your home. You will come with us." That refusal told me plenty. These men did not want to be anywhere they could be legally trapped. They needed me outside, away from potential witnesses, away from security cameras, which meant their endgame was not about issuing fines or filling out paperwork. From somewhere down the street, a dog barked sharply, as if sensing the tension. A curtain moved in the window of the house across from mine, then quickly closed. I knew some of my neighbors had seen these men before. I had caught brief mentions of new HOA officers in casual conversation, always accompanied by vague discomfort or uncertainty. Nobody had asked too many questions, probably assuming it was just another tedious committee decision. But now, standing in my doorway with two imposters trying to drag me away, the puzzle began to assemble itself in my mind. These men were not just harassing homeowners. They were scouting for vulnerabilities, for opportunities to intimidate and extract money. My guess was they had already succeeded with others in the neighborhood. Asterisk. Digging into the HOA's dark side that night, long after the two fake HOA police left my doorstep with a final threat to return for my compliance, I sat in my study, the quiet hum of my computer filling the otherwise silent room. The memory of their smug faces lingered in my mind, but beneath that irritation, there was something deeper, a distinct sense of familiarity in the way they moved and spoke. Criminal behavior has patterns. The swaggering overconfidence, the forced authority, the readiness to escalate if challenged, all of it pointed to people who had run similar operations before. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers, and let my thoughts sift through the day's events like evidence on a crime board. These men had approached me without hesitation, which meant one of two things. They had no idea who I truly was, or they were testing the boundaries to see how much they could push before I broke. Either scenario warranted investigation. I began with the HOA's public records. As far as the real Homeowners Association was concerned, there was no mention of an enforcement division with arrest powers. The HOA board, made up mostly of retirees and well-meaning busybodies, handled fines through letters, not handcuffs. Their meetings, which I had occasionally attended to keep up appearances, had never included discussions about hiring private security. Yet, according to chatter from neighbors and passing conversations, this enforcement group had been operating for at least 3 months. That meant they were either incredibly bold or had enough residents too frightened or too embarrassed to come forward. Pulling up my encrypted database, I began searching for cross-references of similar scams in surrounding counties. The results came in faster than expected. In 3 other neighborhoods across the state, groups posing as HOA enforcers had shown up, issued absurd citations, and demanded payment on the spot, sometimes in cash, sometimes via shady online portals that vanished within days. In at least one case, a homeowner had been forcibly taken into a van under the pretense of processing, and later dumped outside city limits after his family paid a hefty fine to secure his release. That incident had been dismissed by local police as a misunderstanding due to the victim's reluctance to press charges, likely out of fear. The implications were clear. This was not a one-off scam. This was an organized operation moving from neighborhood to neighborhood, extracting what they could before disappearing. My gut told me the operation here was being run by someone with a stake in the community, a face people recognized enough to trust. And there was one person who fit that role perfectly, Karen Whitmore. Self-proclaimed interim president of the HOA, Karen had a reputation for making herself the center of every dispute. In the years since I moved in, she had knocked on my door 3 times to welcome me, each visit dripping with passive-aggressive commentary about my yard, my car, or my supposedly unfriendly demeanor. She was the kind of person who kept a mental catalog of everyone's business and believed that gave her power. The next morning, I took a calculated risk. Under the guise of casual neighborly curiosity, I visited the Petersons, an elderly couple living 2 houses down. Their porch smelled faintly of fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls, and they welcomed me with the warmth of people who rarely had company. Over coffee, I steered the conversation toward the HOA's recent rule enforcement. Mrs. Peterson's face paled, and she glanced at her husband before speaking in a lowered voice. "They came here too," she whispered. Sighed. "Our roof shingles weren't regulation color, and we'd have to pay a fine immediately. We didn't want trouble, so we paid them." The shame in her tone was unmistakable, but more telling was the way her hands trembled as she lifted her cup. "Did you tell the board?" I asked gently. Mr. Peterson shook his head. "We thought they were the board," he admitted. That was the problem. These criminals had blurred the line between legitimate authority and intimidation so effectively that people assumed compliance was their only option. As I walked back home, the morning sun casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns, I spotted a dark SUV idling at the end of the street. Its tinted windows made it impossible to see inside, but the slow, deliberate way it rolled forward as I passed told me I was being watched. Later that afternoon, while doing a slow drive through the neighborhood under the pretense of running errands, I noticed the same SUV parked near a small rental property 3 streets over. It was a run-down garage attached to a 2-story house, the kind of place that never seemed to have the same tenant for more than a month. My instincts prickled. The windows of the garage were covered in blackout curtains, but faint movement inside suggested activity. I made a mental note of the address, then continued driving, careful not to linger too long. That evening, I reviewed the recordings from the hidden camera in my doorbell. The video caught both men from the previous day in sharp detail, their faces fully visible. Running a quick facial recognition scan against my offline database yielded partial matches. Both had previous arrests for fraud and impersonation in another state. Their names were listed as aliases, which confirmed they were operating under false identities here. The next step was risky, but necessary. I needed first-hand confirmation of their base of operations, and that meant surveillance. Just after midnight, dressed in dark clothing, I made my way back to the rental property. From the cover of a row of tall hedges, I watched the garage door open briefly. Inside, I saw folding tables stacked with clipboards, envelopes, and stacks of what looked like printed violation notices. A corkboard on the wall displayed a map of the neighborhood with several houses circled in red ink. Mine was one of them. That was all the confirmation I needed. This was a targeted operation. But one detail made my jaw tighten. In the corner of the garage sat a small, unmarked box filled with personal mail that clearly belonged to my neighbors. That meant they had been stealing from mailboxes, likely to find financial information or identify high-value targets. This was no longer just a matter of intimidation. It was a serious federal crime, and my FBI instincts told me the deeper I dug, the uglier this was going to get. The trap is set the next morning. Sunlight poured into my kitchen in warm streams, but it did little to thaw the cold resolve forming inside me. By now, the pieces of this puzzle were not only fitting together, they were painting a picture of calculated exploitation, the kind that thrived in communities where trust was taken for granted. I had seen this before in different guises: fake inspectors in rural towns, bogus charity workers in suburban neighborhoods, counterfeit contractors targeting the elderly. The playbook was always similar: establish authority, create fear, demand compliance. But this particular scam had an added twist. They were not just looking for quick cash. They were building a network of control over their victims, conditioning them to obey without question. That was a far more dangerous kind of con, and it needed to be dismantled before it could spread any further. The problem was that I could not simply march into their garage hideout with my badge and shut it down. Doing that without sufficient evidence would risk blowing my cover and letting key players slip away. No, I needed them to make the first move again on my terms, which meant setting bait they could not resist. That afternoon, I went to work in my front yard, deliberately breaking as many HOA rules as I could think of in one sitting. I replaced my regulation-approved mailbox with an old, dented one I had salvaged from a property years ago during an investigation. I planted a row of bright, non-native flowers in my garden, gaudy enough to be visible from the street. I even hung a small flag from my porch railing, knowing full well that, according to the real HOA handbook, it was perfectly legal. But in their fabricated version of the rules, it would be yet another violation. Every move was calculated, not just to draw them out, but to make them think I was a particularly easy target, someone reckless enough to ignore their first warning and naive enough to provoke them again. While working, I kept my phone in my pocket, linked to a hidden camera in the birdhouse across my lawn. The camera had a wide-angle view of the street and a clear line of sight to my front door. If they came, I would have them in high definition, this time with audio. I also made sure to leave my security lights off that evening, creating the illusion of vulnerability. Criminals like these were predators, and predators always struck where they sensed weakness. By early evening, the neighborhood had settled into its usual rhythm: children riding bikes down the sidewalks, sprinklers hissing on manicured lawns, the occasional bark of a dog echoing in the still air. I kept to the shadows of my living room, watching through a narrow slit in the blinds. At 9:17 p.m., the familiar dark SUV rolled slowly past my house. It did not stop. Instead, it made a deliberate loop around the block, returning 10 minutes later. This time, it parked half a street away, just beyond the reach of most porch cameras. I noted the tactic they were learning to adapt, which only reinforced the need to act before they grew bolder. Shortly after midnight, the SUV returned. The garage light from their base of operations was on earlier than usual that night, suggesting they were preparing for something. I watched as two figures exited the vehicle, moving with a purposeful stride. They were not in uniform this time, but the bulky shapes under their jackets told me they were carrying handcuffs, possibly other equipment. They approached my yard cautiously, scanning the street as if expecting someone to be watching. The taller one, the same man from my first encounter, motioned toward my new mailbox and muttered something to his partner. I could not hear every word, but I caught fragments. Flag 2, roses again. Make him an example. I waited until they were within a few feet of my porch before I stepped outside, feigning surprise. You again? I said, my tone just sharp enough to bait them. I thought we were done playing pretend cops. The taller man's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening on the cuffs at his side. You were warned, he said. You ignored it. Now we do things the hard way. Before they could take another step, the sound of a distant engine rumbled down the street. My backup 2 unmarked cars I had quietly arranged to be nearby rolled into position without lights, stopping at the far corners of the block. The men did not notice them yet, too focused on me. I stepped back into the glow of my porch light, making sure their faces were fully visible to my camera. Go ahead, I told them. Do the hard way. But make sure you look right into that little birdhouse over there while you do it. The heavier man glanced toward the birdhouse, confusion flashing across his face. Then realization dawned, and his partner hissed under his breath, "We need to go, now." They turned, but by then it was too late. The unmarked cars had pulled in silently, cutting off their escape. Doors opened, agents stepped out, and in a matter of seconds, the men were surrounded. I kept my expression neutral as they were cuffed not by fake metal this time, but by the real thing. Yet, even as they were taken into custody, I knew this was not the end. The smaller fish had been caught, but the one orchestrating all of this, the one whose name had surfaced in whispers and fearful glances, was still out there. Karen had not shown her face tonight, which meant she was either too cautious to be present or confident enough to think she could operate without being tied to the men she commanded. Either way, she had just moved from being a nuisance to becoming my primary target, and I had every intention of drawing her out. The confrontation, the arrests of the two imposters sent ripples through the neighborhood, though most residents did not yet understand the full weight of what had happened. The next morning, I walked past a few front porches where whispers were already traveling from one set of lips to another, carried with the quiet excitement of people sensing drama, yet lacking the details to piece it together. I kept my pace steady, nodding politely but not engaging. The less anyone suspected my direct involvement, the more freedom I had to operate. Officially, the two men were being held for questioning on charges unrelated to the HOA, but in reality, their interrogation was focused on unspooling the web that led straight back to Karen. For the first 2 days after the arrests, Karen's presence vanished from the usual spots. No morning walks to inspect lawns, no sudden appearances at doorsteps to remind people of unapproved decorations, no loud declarations at the community center about keeping our neighborhood safe. It was as if she had retreated entirely. And for a moment, I considered the possibility that she might try to disappear. But then, late on the third night, my instincts were proven right. She was not hiding out of fear. She was calculating her next move. I had been in my study, reviewing the surveillance footage from the garage raid, when a new notification blinked across my secure phone. The birdhouse camera had picked up movement again, only this time it was not the dark SUV, it was Karen herself. She stood at the end of my driveway, her arms crossed, her figure rigid in the cold glow of the street lamp. Her expression was unreadable from the camera's angle, but her stance screamed defiance. Slowly, she walked up the drive, pausing briefly to glance toward my garden, the new mailbox, and the flag that still fluttered lightly in the night air. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out an envelope, and slipped it into my mailbox before walking back to her Cara, sleek silver sedan. I had never seen her drive before. I waited until she was gone before retrieving the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in block letters. "You have one chance to leave this alone. Next time, we will not be sulfur monoxide polite." There was no signature, no identifying marks, but the message was as clear as the chill in the air. She knew, or at least suspected, that I was involved in the disruption of her operation. And she was not the type to back down quietly. The following day, I made my move. I attended the next HOA meeting, one Karen had hastily organized after her extended absence. It was held in the community clubhouse, a space usually reserved for birthday parties and book clubs, now transformed into her stage. She stood at the front, flanked by two unfamiliar men in plain clothes, both with the same clipped posture and scanning eyes I had seen in hired muscle before. She addressed the room with the practiced charm of someone who believed she still had her audience in her grip. "Recent events have caused unnecessary panic in our community," she began, her voice carrying just enough warmth to mask the steel underneath. "I want to assure you that your safety is our priority, and any disruptions will be handled swiftly and decisively." Her gaze swept the room, landing on me for the briefest of moments before moving on. "Certain individuals," she continued, have taken it upon themselves to meddle in matters that do not concern them, spreading rumors and undermining the stability we work so hard to maintain. I did not interrupt. Not yet. Instead, I let her weave her net, speaking of order and unity while subtly casting me as the outsider. But then, when she called for community concerns, I raised my hand. I have one, I said evenly, my voice carrying just enough to reach the back of the room. What exactly is the HOA's official policy on deploying unlicensed enforcement officers to detain residents in their own homes? A murmur rippled through the room, neighbors turning to look at one another. Corinne's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning, sharper this time. I am not sure what you mean, she said, her tone light but her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Our volunteers are authorized to. They are not volunteers, I cut in, stepping forward now. They are criminals. 2 of them were arrested right here in this neighborhood 3 nights ago. And unless you want the rest of your volunteers facing the same fate, I suggest you stop pretending you do not know what I am talking about. The room went still. One of the men at her side shifted, his hand inching toward his jacket. I caught the movement and met his gaze directly, letting the quiet weight of my stare freeze him in place. Corinne's composure cracked just enough for me to see the flash of anger underneath. You have no proof, she said, her voice low now, the performance for the room slipping away. I smiled faintly. I have all the proof I need. And more importantly, the people you have been intimidating finally know the truth. This ends now, Corinne. For a moment, I thought she might order her men to act right there in front of everyone. But instead, she straightened her posture, smoothed her coat, and gave a brittle laugh. Meeting adjourned, she announced, turning on her heel and walking out. Her men followed, but not before giving me one last look, a silent promise that this was far from over. I left the clubhouse knowing full well that the confrontation had only shifted the battlefield. She was going to strike back, but this time, I would be ready. And when she did, it would be her last move. The bigger conspiracy, the night after the HOA meeting. I sat in my study with the blinds drawn, the desk lamp casting a single warm halo over a growing pile of documents. I had not been able to shake the expression on Corinne's face when I confronted her. It was not just anger, it was calculation. The measured kind that comes from someone who has operated in the shadows long enough to know when to retreat and when to strike. She was not rattled by the arrests of her enforcers. She was adjusting. That meant her operation was bigger than I had initially assumed, and losing 2 men was just a small inconvenience. Pulling up my secure case files, I began cross-referencing Corinne's name, known aliases, and any business registrations tied to her in the last 15 years. At first, the results were unremarkable standard property records, tax filings, a few HOA-related forms that painted the picture of an overzealous community organizer. But then I found something more interesting. A nonprofit corporation registered under her name 3 years ago in another state. The nonprofit's stated mission was neighborhood safety initiatives, but there was no trace of actual community programs. Instead, the financial reports showed large, unexplained cash deposits followed by equally large withdrawals. The real breakthrough came when I compared her travel history pulled discreetly from a combination of surveillance data and license plate recognition records with the timelines of similar HOA scam reports in other states. The overlaps were almost perfect. Every time one of these fake enforcement groups popped up, Corinne's car had been documented within a 20-mile radius. She was the common denominator, the spider at the center of the web. And she had been running this operation for years. The more I dug, the clearer the scope became. She was not just targeting wealthy neighborhoods. She was systematically identifying communities with a particular vulnerability, disorganized or complacent HOA boards, Her team would arrive posing as special compliance officers, issue absurd violations, and demand immediate payment. For homeowners who resisted, the intimidation escalated threats, property damage, even fabricated legal notices. In a few cases, residents had been lured away from their homes under false pretenses and pressured into handing over cash to avoid legal trouble. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the growing wall of evidence pinned to the corkboard behind my desk. Photos of Karen at various locations, copies of forged violation notices, bank statements, rental agreements for properties she used as temporary headquarters. It was all there. But what concerned me most was that this was not a small-time grift. She had multiple teams in different regions, each operating semi-independently but reporting back to her. That kind of structure meant she had lieutenants people loyal, enough to manage parts of the operation without her direct oversight. The arrests in my neighborhood would have put her on high alert, but they also gave me leverage. The 2 men we had taken in were still in custody, facing multiple charges. Under pressure, one of them had started talking, and what he revealed was enough to turn this into a multi-state federal case. He confirmed that Karen's network had hit at least 6 other neighborhoods this year alone, netting hundreds of thousands in cash and untraceable payments. He also revealed that the next target was already in motion, a gated community 2 towns over with an elderly HOA board and a reputation for strict property codes. That information was the opening I needed. If Karen thought she could shift her operation and avoid heat here, I could make sure her next move became her undoing. I contacted my supervisor at the bureau and laid out the plan. We would stage a sting operation in the targeted neighborhood, using undercover agents posing as homeowners. We would let Karen's people make their approach, document every step of the scam, and catch her in the act. But to pull it off, we needed to make sure she felt confident enough to attend in person. Drawing Karen out meant making her believe the neighborhood was both ripe for the taking and unaware of her reputation. I reached out to an old contact in the state's HOA network, feeding him a carefully crafted story about a friend who was struggling to enforce community rules in a retirement-heavy gated community. Within days, the bait had been set. A fake HOA president from our team extended an open invitation to Karen to consult on improving compliance. It was exactly the kind of ego-stroking opportunity she loved. Another chance to position herself as the authority figure and tighten her grip on yet another set of unsuspecting residents. While my team prepared the undercover, set up hidden cameras in mailboxes, microphones embedded in lawn ornaments, unmarked cars staged just outside the gates, I focused on the most important part, ensuring we had undeniable evidence tying Karen to aspect of the scam. That meant not just catching her issuing fake violations, but documenting her handling of the money, giving orders to her enforcers, and making threats. We needed her to reveal herself completely. The night before the sting, I could feel the weight of months of quiet investigation pressing on my shoulders. My cover in my own neighborhood had held, but this next step meant putting myself closer to Karen than ever before. I would be playing the role of an unaware homeowner in the gated community, one she would likely recognize from the HOA meeting confrontation. That recognition was a risk, but it was also a weapon. If she saw me and thought I was just another target, her arrogance might make her careless. The morning of the operation, the sky was overcast, the kind of muted gray that seemed to press down on everything. I arrived at the community gates in an unremarkable sedan, wearing clothes that screamed middle-class suburban, rule-abiding resident. The guard waved me through, unaware that he was part of the staged environment. My assigned home was a tidy 2-story with a porch swing and a freshly painted fence, exactly the kind of place Karen's operation would flag for unauthorized modifications if it fit their fabricated rules. By midday, the first signs of her arrival appeared. A white van with tinted windows rolled past slowly, pausing in front of select houses as if taking notes. Minutes later, Karen herself arrived in the same silver sedan I had seen outside my driveway. She stepped out, her expression cool, her posture radiating confidence. Two men followed her, carrying clipboards and envelopes. As they split off to approach different houses, Karen walked directly toward mine. I stepped onto the porch, playing my role to perfection, confused, polite, just slightly defensive. "Can I help you?" I asked as she reached the steps. Her smile was practiced, her tone dripping with condescension. "Yes, you can. I am here on behalf of the Compliance Board, and I am afraid you are in violation of several community regulations. But do not worry, we can resolve this quickly if you are cooperative." Behind her, two cameras hidden in potted plants captured every word, every gesture. I feigned uncertainty, asking her to explain the violations. She listed them in rapid succession, most of them absurd, all of them designed to intimidate. Then, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "It is better for you if we settle this now. Cash preferably." That was it, the moment we had been waiting for. I kept her talking for another 2 minutes, long enough for my team to capture multiple angles and crystal clear audio. Then, on my signal, the unmarked cars moved in, blocking the van and the sedan. Karen's smile faltered as she realized what was happening. "You," she hissed, recognition dawning. "You set me up." I met her glare with a steady gaze. "No. Karen, you set yourself up. I just made sure the cameras were rolling." Within minutes, she was in cuffs, the full scope of her operation laid bare. And this time, there would be no escaping through loopholes or intimidation. She was going down for good. Justice served. The sound of the cuffs locking around Karen's wrists was sharp and final, like the last click of a long unfinished puzzle snapping into place. She did not fight or scream, but the tension in her jaw was enough to tell me that she was already calculating her next move, searching for any angle that might keep her from facing the full consequences. I had seen this look before in people who thought themselves untouchable. It was not fear, but disbelief, the stunned realization that their carefully built house of cards had finally been kicked down. As the agents guided her toward the unmarked vehicle, her gaze flicked toward me, and for a brief second, her composure cracked. I caught the faintest glimmer of resentment, mixed with something more primal, acceptance that her game was over. The operation's cleanup was meticulous. The van was searched on-site, revealing dozens of forged HOA violation letters, cash envelopes labeled with house numbers, and a black ledger that appeared to be Karen's personal record of collections. It was damning evidence, tying her directly to every illegal act committed by her enforcers. At the same time, our team executed warrants on the rental properties linked to her, uncovering even more materials, stacks of stolen mail, counterfeit IDs, bank account ledgers, and a storage locker filled with seized property from previous victims. Every new discovery strengthened the case against her, building a legal wall she would never climb over. By the following morning, the news had already spread. Local media covered the arrest under the headline, "Fake HOA Crackdown, Mastermind." In custody, accompanied by images of the seized evidence. But what the public did not see were the private reactions, the phone calls from grateful neighbors, the quiet relief of people who had lived in fear for months, the cautious smiles from those who now realized they had been freed from a silent, oppressive grip. For the first time since moving into my neighborhood, I saw a real sense of unity among the residents, not one manufactured by fear or control, but built on shared relief and justice served. Karen's trial was set within weeks, thanks to the sheer volume of evidence and the willingness of victims from multiple states to come forward. Many of them had been reluctant at first, still haunted by the intimidation they had faced. But once they learned how wide her network had stretched, they realized they were not alone. In the courtroom, Karen tried to regain her old persona, poised, self-assured, spinning elaborate explanations about misunderstandings and volunteer safety patrols. But the weight of the facts crushed every performance she attempted. The forged documents, the stolen mail, the recorded conversations, the financial records, all of it painted a picture so complete that even her own attorney seemed to shrink under its gravity. I attended the sentencing quietly, sitting near the back. When the judge handed down a prison term long enough to ensure she would never run her scams again, there was no applause, no celebration, just a deep collective exhale. For the victims, the victory was not in her punishment alone, but in the knowledge that they could walk outside their own front doors, without fear of being watched, harassed, or shaken down by someone claiming authority they did not have. In the weeks that followed, life in the neighborhood began to normalize. The real HOA, now fully aware of how dangerously they had been infiltrated, took concrete steps to regain the trust of residents. They implemented transparent communication systems, stricter hiring policies, and community watch programs that were truly voluntary and accountable. People who had avoided each other out of suspicion began to talk again, sometimes over fences, sometimes on long walks with their dogs. The tension that had once hung over our streets like a storm cloud finally began to lift. As for me, I kept my role quiet. The bureau handled the official statements, and my name was never mentioned publicly. That was exactly how I wanted it. My work thrived in the shadows, and the satisfaction I felt did not come from recognition. It came from watching people reclaim the peace that had been stolen from them. Still, I did leave one small reminder for the neighbors who had unknowingly been part of the sting. One by one, envelopes began appearing in mailboxes, each containing cash equal to what they had been scammed out of, along with a simple note typed on plain paper. Your FBI neighbor says hello. Your trust is restored. Keep it safe. I never signed my name, but I did not need to. The people who had been most affected knew exactly where the money had come from, and the quiet nods I sometimes received in passing were more than enough. Months later, when I stood on my porch watching children play in the street again, without glancing over their shoulders, I felt that familiar stillness in the air, the kind that once had carried tension, now carried only calm. The fake HOA police were gone. Their leader was behind bars, and the neighborhood had reclaimed its own authority. For all the danger and deception, for all the nights spent watching and waiting, it had been worth it. Justice was not always swift, and it was rarely clean. On this street, in this small corner of the world, it had been complete. And for me, that was enough.